New Orleans, 1919. A city paralyzed by fear. An unknown killer moving through the night. No clear motive, no warning. Then a letter appears in the newspapers. The writer claims to be the murderer and makes a promise that will turn an entire city into music. If you enjoy this kind of story, please subscribe, like, and share the video. It really helps the channel grow. Let's begin. The attacks began in 1918. New Orleans was no stranger to violence, but what was happening inside certain homes felt different. The attacker did not behave like a typical burglar. There was no forced entry in the usual sense. Doors were often found locked, windows undisturbed. Instead, in several cases, entry appeared to have been made through rear panels of homes, a method that required knowledge of local architecture. Once inside, the attacker did not bring his own weapon. He used the victim's axes. That detail would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The weapon was already there. It belonged to the household. It was turned against them while they slept. The assaults were sudden and brutal. Victims were struck in the head, often while still in bed. Some survived, others did not. There was no consistent pattern in age or status. Families were targeted, couples were attacked. The crimes did not appear financially motivated. Valuables were left untouched. Authorities struggled to identify a suspect. Witness descriptions were inconsistent and limited. The attacks occurred at night, in darkness, with little opportunity for identification. In some cases, neighbors reported hearing nothing at all. The press began referring to the unknown attacker as the Axeman. As reports spread, fear followed. Residents reinforced doors and windows. Some slept lightly, expecting the sound of movement in the dark. The unpredictability of the attacks made them more terrifying. There was no clear reason for selection. No warning. No apparent end. Law enforcement pursued leads, but none produced an arrest. At the time, investigative methods were limited. Fingerprinting was still developing. Communication between jurisdictions was slower than it would later become. By early 1919, the Axeman had become a figure larger than the crimes themselves. The name carried weight. It carried myth. And it carried uncertainty. Then in March 1919, the case took an unexpected turn. A letter arrived at the offices of a New Orleans newspaper. The author claimed to be the Axeman. What the letter contained would transform fear into something far stranger. On March 13, 1919, a letter arrived at the offices of the Times-Picayune, one of New Orleans' major newspapers. It was unsigned, but the writer claimed to be the Axeman. The letter was written in a tone that was theatrical, taunting, and unsettling. The author denied being human in conventional terms, describing himself instead as a spirit and a demon from the hottest regions of hell. He mocked the police and dismissed any suggestion that he could be captured. Most disturbingly, he made an announcement. He wrote that he would kill again on the following Tuesday night, shortly after midnight. The time was specified, 12:15 a.m. Then came the condition. The writer stated that he was fond of jazz music. He declared that any home in which jazz was being played at the appointed hour would be spared. Every other home, he implied, was at risk. The message was clear. Play jazz and you would live. Remain silent, and you might not. The letter was published. Once it appeared in print, the threat moved from rumor to public declaration. Whether the author was truly responsible for the previous attacks or not, the fear was now official. It was scheduled. It had a time and a date. Authorities faced a difficult decision. The letter could not be ignored, but publishing it also risked amplifying panic. Once printed, The entire city knew what had been promised. The response was immediate. New Orleans was already deeply connected to jazz. The music was woven into the identity of the city. But this was different. This was not celebration. It was self-preservation. Clubs prepared for larger crowds than usual. Musicians were booked for the night in question. Families who owned instruments prepared to use them. Those who did not reportedly turned to phonographs or improvised however they could. The Axeman had transformed a threat into a ritual. For the first time, the violence seemed governed by rules, however irrational they might have been. The city did not know whether the promise would be kept. It did not know whether the writer was truly the killer. It did not know if silence would mean death. What it did know was the time. Midnight was coming, and New Orleans would not meet it quietly. On the evening of March 19th, 1919, New Orleans prepared for midnight. The city did not treat the threat lightly. Whether residents believed the letter completely or only partially, the risk felt real. The Axeman had already established a pattern of unpredictable violence. Now, for the first time, a specific hour had been named. Shortly before 12:15 a.m., music filled the air. Jazz poured from dance halls and bars across the city. Musicians played longer sets than usual. Crowds gathered not only for entertainment, but for reassurance. Being surrounded by sound felt safer than silence. In private homes, families reportedly opened windows and played phonographs at full volume. Some who owned instruments played them into the night. Newspapers later described the atmosphere as one of collective defiance mixed with fear. The streets were not silent. The city was loud. Exactly how many homes participated is impossible to verify. Contemporary reports suggest widespread compliance, but precise numbers were never recorded. What is documented is this: that night passed without a reported Axeman attack. No murders were attributed to him on March 19th. For many residents, that was enough to believe the condition had worked. The letter had promised mercy to those who played jazz, and no new victims were reported the following morning. Whether this absence of violence was coincidence, deliberate restraint, or evidence that the letter's author was not responsible for all prior attacks remains unknown. The police did not identify a suspect that night. There were no arrests tied directly to the letter. The city woke up the next day, shaken but alive. The event quickly became part of local lore. Jazz, already central to New Orleans' identity, had seemingly played a role in protecting it. The story spread beyond Louisiana, carried by newspapers that repeated the tale of the killer who spared music lovers. But fear did not disappear. The Axeman attacks did not end permanently that night. Violence associated with the case would continue in the months that followed, though inconsistencies in method and circumstance raised questions about whether a single individual was responsible for every crime attributed to the name. The letter had created a spectacle. It had given the killer a voice, and it had shown how easily terror could manipulate an entire city. By late 1919, the attacks stopped. There would be no definitive arrest, no confirmed confession. The Axeman faded from active headlines, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty and a single night that blurred the line between threat and performance. From the beginning, the investigation into the Axeman attacks faced limitations. Crime scene procedures in 1918 and 1919 were far less advanced than modern standards. Fingerprinting was still developing as a reliable tool. Communication between departments was slower, and coordination across jurisdictions was inconsistent. Each attack was investigated largely on its own terms. In several cases, Entry into the homes appeared to have been made by removing wooden panels from rear doors. The intruder did not typically break windows or force locks in obvious ways. This detail led some investigators to believe the attacker had familiarity with local house construction. Victims were often of Italian descent, which led to early speculation about organized crime or personal vendettas. However, no clear evidence tied the attacks to a single gang or conflict. Over time, that theory weakened. Suspects were questioned. Leads were followed. But none resulted in a lasting arrest tied conclusively to the series. One man, Joseph Momfrey, was later named by some sources as a possible suspect, particularly in connection with a later killing in Los Angeles. However, there is no definitive evidence proving he was the Axeman, and historians remain divided on whether the crimes attributed to the name were committed by a single individual. Another complication was the variation in details between attacks. While many shared similarities, some differed in method or circumstance. This has led some researchers to question whether every crime attributed to the Axeman was truly connected. By late 1919, the attack stopped. There was no dramatic capture, no public confession, no official closure. The case gradually moved from active investigation into unresolved history. New Orleans continued to grow, jazz continued to evolve, and the story of the Axeman shifted from crime report to legend. The letter remained one of the most unusual elements of the case. It was theatrical, self-aware, and designed to manipulate fear on a citywide scale. Whether the author was the true killer or someone exploiting public panic has never been conclusively determined. What remains documented is this: a series of brutal nighttime attacks occurred. A letter was sent to the press. On a specified night, the city played jazz. No Axeman murder was reported that evening, and the killer was never definitively identified. More than a century later, the Axeman exists somewhere between fact and folklore. Not because the crimes were fictional, but because the answers were never found.